Dr. Bronwen Catherine McShea is a historian and author based in New York City. She specializes in early modern European history and the history of Catholicism. She holds advanced degrees from Harvard and Yale, serves as visiting assistant professor at the Augustine Institute Graduate School, and is an advisory editor for the Institutum Historicum Societatis Iesu in Rome, or Roma at this point, focusing on Christianity's cultural impact. And as you know, this lecture on Church and State Were United, the role of powerful women in historically Christian regimes.
Okay.
Dr.
Thank you.
Lord.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Orlandi, for the invitation to come here to speak to everyone today. I'm really honored to be here. Can everyone hear me okay in the back? Very good. It's also a joy for me personally to be here, partly thanks to Mariana's efforts in particular, because of that memorable year we spent together in Princeton as research fellows of the Madison program. Now, as you just heard in the intro about me, I am an historian, and I spent a lot of time mentally in time periods long before our own, and in places quite different from the United States today. And I like to take audiences into the past whenever I can to get us reflecting on our presumptions about the past and on how the past can cast our own times in a new light. So my job, it's a rather enjoyable one sometimes, is to tell stories about the past and then let other people think about it and its implications for the present. So we'll have a Q&A after this, I think, right? So we'll see what happens there. So I'm going to do this today on the theme of when church and state were united, the role of powerful women in historically Christian regimes. Now, as some of you might already be thinking, I'm combining things in that title that many people might presume don't belong together. If I'm talking about periods in the distant past when Christian churches, such as the Roman Catholic Church or the Church of England, were united with political regimes, typically monarchical regimes, and not separated constitutionally, as is the norm and strong preference of most people today, how can I be linking the power of women to that? Weren't women generally powerless in Western societies before, say, the past 100 years or so, when we started to get the vote in societies that were putting our traditional Christian political pasts behind us? That's how many people might think of this. Now, at least some people in earlier centuries would have found our presumptions about this a little strange. Indeed, various concerned men in the Renaissance and Reformation period actually thought that women were becoming too powerful in Christian Europe in their day. And a very famous example was the Scottish Protestant minister and reformer John Knox, who published this rather remarkably titled pamphlet in 1558, the first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous regiment of women. Early modern titles are one of the most enjoyable aspects of being an early modern historian. This is one of the shorter ones, right to the point. So in the summer of 1558, Knox's native Scotland was ruled by Mary of Guise, the mother and queen regent, or temporary substitute for her daughter Mary of Scotland, who was the country's monarch. And England, next door, was at the time ruled by Queen Mary I, the eldest child of King Henry VIII. Both ruling women were Catholics, and Knox objected to this as well as to their having public authority as women, because he believed that biblical teaching on the rule of women was clear and that they should not hold public power. Now, embarrassingly for Knox, Mary I died soon after this, and suddenly England was ruled by a Protestant, but a Protestant woman, Elizabeth I, Mary's younger sister. Now, Elizabeth was rather offended by Knox's pamphlet, and she would not let him step foot in England after she took the throne, much to his chagrin. Now, during the Renaissance and Reformation period, other women held positions of power and public authority in Christian Europe. Now, on the slide above are just some of the more famous in this period. I'm just going from across the top, across the bottom. Isabella of Portugal, the Duchess and sometimes Regent of Burgundy, her daughter-in-law Margaret of York, who also served as the Duchess of Burgundy and then Protector of Burgundy upon her husband Charles the Bold's death, the powerful and controversial Queen Isabella of Castile, famous for sponsoring Christopher Columbus's voyages across the Atlantic and instituting the dreaded Spanish Inquisition, Queen Marguerite of Navarre, a great patroness of Renaissance learning, Marguerite's daughter, Queen Jeanne III of Navarre, who was a leading European Protestant in her day, two rather strong Catholic rulers, Juana of Austria, who was regent of Spain for a time, and her sister, Maria of Austria, who was a Holy Roman Empress for a time, Queen Catherine de' Medici, who had considerable power in France during the reigns of three of her sons, and Queen Anne of Austria, who ruled France for a time during the younger years of her son, King Louis XIV. Now, I'll come back to some of these figures as I go along a bit later. I just want to underscore here, though, that some of the strongest worded statements and oppositions to women's rule, statements from which we often draw our understandings of attitudes at the time, are from printed books. They were penned in this period when such women held positions of power, directing various state affairs, and even, as we'll see, church affairs in ways that their opponents disapproved. Now, I've titled this lecture, When Church and State Were United, simply because it's the specific ways that powerful women in historically Christian regimes contributed at times to the governance, the disciplining, and reform of politically established churches that I want to highlight here. Just as a fact. I'm not saying it's positive or negative, just a fact of history. This is a theme that interests me greatly as an historian of Christianity in particular, because I operated for many years under the false assumption that even elite Christian women, whatever their high status, had little to do with ecclesiastical affairs specifically through most of Christianity's history. And this was an assumption I had based on things I was told at different points in my historical education. And I was aware of what I had assumed were isolated exceptions, such as Isabella of Spain and Elizabeth I. But it was not until I began the research for my second book, several years after finishing up graduate school, that I began to realize that at least some Christian women of more distant centuries exerted significant powers within and with respect to their churches, and in ways that ironically would be unthinkable to many modern-day Christians. Now, the book project I just mentioned, I always do a free commercial during my talks. The book project I just mentioned that opened my eyes to certain underappreciated aspects of church history was the one that led to the publication by Pegasus Books in New York a year ago of this book, La Duchesse, The Life of Marie de Vignerot, Cardinal Richelieu's forgotten heiress who shaped the fate of France. There's a bit of a fad for long subtitles for biographies these days. So in this lecture, I actually want to spend a bit of time highlighting some things from that book, zooming in on some of the ways in which my 17th century subject, despite not even being one of the royal women that I highlighted a moment ago, shaped the Catholic Church in France and in several other parts of the world. And I'll then zoom out from her story and speak in the second half of the lecture to ways in which this 17th century French duchess was part of a larger tradition of powerful women affecting ecclesiastical affairs and historical Christian regimes over time. So my book, La Duchesse, is about a woman named Marie de Vignerot. She lived from the year 1604 to 1675. Known best by a title that she acquired in her 30s, that is the title of Duchess of Aiguillon, she was the niece and heiress of a very famous and controversial man, the Cardinal Duc de Richelieu, who served as King Louis XIII's first minister of state in the 1620s up to 1642 when he died. Cardinal Richelieu became Marie's guardian when she was 20, after she had lost both of her parents and a husband that she had been required to marry at only 16. Now, some of you here might know Cardinal Richelieu from fictional portrayals such as The Three Musketeers. He was a clergyman who governed France with an iron grip as Louis XIII's prime minister. And it's impossible to understand the birth of European nationalism or the origins of the modern French state and its self-consciously French national culture without some reference to him. So every French schoolchild knows a lot about Cardinal Richelieu as one of the key figures in their nation's history. Now, while Richelieu is one of the most famous men in European history, very few people, even in France, know today that one of his most trusted right hands was his niece, whom he mentored and to whom he bequeathed much of his monumental legacy upon his death in 1642. Now, Richelieu brought Marie into his inner circle when she was quite young, and she was entrusted eventually with a dukedom and a peerage, which gave her privileged access to the monarch, both of which she held in her own right, not by virtue of a father's title or a husband's title. So she basically had the power of a duke, not just of a duke's wife, right? And a peer of France was somebody who, in certain contexts, had could sort of relate to the king as an equal in certain settings, and they had a lot of patronage power in a society that really depended on personal patronage from aristocrats. So the cardinal also made her, importantly, the executrix of his will, as well as his heiress. And this put her on a par with Europe's princes in terms of the wealth, influence, and power that it gave to her. Now, the cardinal minister chose his niece for her talents, her judgment, and her courage over and above her brother, Francois, who's a bit of a disaster, and above other male relatives who had started life with numerous comparative advantages simply by virtue of their sex. Now, over time, Marie spied for Richelieu. She helped him gain control of the French government early in his career in her role as a high-ranking lady-in-waiting at court. There are elements of this that do sound like a novel, but this is all historical. She even stood in for him at times in important meetings and at major functions. And she influenced some of his decisions regarding which individuals, projects, and institutions that the French crown would favor, both with state and church appointments, and with funding, protection, and sometimes merciful legal judgments. And she had a hand in saving the lives of a few enemies of Richelieu who would have been executed but for her intervention. Significantly, she sometimes was given control over which churchmen would become bishops in France in the selection of bishops. And the selection of bishops in those days was actually not done by the Pope in Rome in most cases, but was actually done through a mix of clerical and lay decisions in various Catholic countries. Now, furthermore, long after Richelieu's time, and at times while residing in her great chateau west of Paris, I just thought I'd show a beautiful print of that chateau, which the royal family was envious of. Marie continued to influence French political and religious affairs in significant ways. She had a direct say, for example, over the selection of bishops for new Catholic missionary dioceses that were set up in Asia and North America at a time when certain missionaries are going out into the world from Europe in significant numbers for the first time. Also, she was involved in founding and directing many Catholic seminaries as well as charitable institutions that were animated by a strong reforming spirit with the goals of disciplining the clergy and addressing social problems such as rural poverty and undereducation. Now, in pursuing her political, cultural, and religious goals, Marie took advantage of the political networks that her uncle bequeathed to her when he died. And when I found this in the historical records, I was kind of shocked, frankly. He had actually entrusted his niece, not the crown, not his successors in public office, with most of his state papers when he died. There were a lot of state secrets in there and various things about various very powerful people in France and beyond. And she had private knowledge of this that even his successor's prime minister did not have. And she was adept at leveraging influence and intelligence that she had on people with various officials and nobles because of this. She came to have tremendous influence at the Regency court of Queen Anne of Austria in the center there. That's the mother of King Louis XIV, the Sun King. And she had so much influence at court that was unofficial, because a woman could not be prime minister, that Cardinal Jules Mazarin, Anne's official first minister of state, regarded Marie as his chief rival for power in all of France. Now, the Duchess also shaped the terms in which Richelieu himself and other prominent churchmen were remembered. She was behind early monuments and publications promoting her uncle's legacy. So part of what we understand about Cardinal Richelieu is partly owed to her initial efforts to kind of preserve and advance his historical legacy. And another figure whose career she helped to make and whose legacy she promoted after he died was her friend Vincent de Paul. Vincent de Paul was a priest who was one of the most famous canonized saints of the Catholic Church, given his radical commitment to serving the poor and the sick. And the Duchess was behind the internationalization of the priestly society and missions to the poor and sick that de Paul founded. Now, something that first drew me to Marie's story is that she built up charitable hospitals, missions, schools, and poverty relief ministries, not only throughout France, but far beyond at times, far beyond the borders of Europe even, in lands where the French were engaged in various ways, either just with trade or diplomacy, sometimes, as in the Americas and Madagascar, through colonization, early colonial efforts. And they were engaged in these various ways with local non-Christian political regimes. And when I was researching the book, I created a map, not very sophisticated, sticking big blue dots on random locations on the map, but I created a map illustrating this global reach of the charitable and religious ventures over which Marie acted as a kind of informal executive. And I was startled, frankly, by her global interests and her reach, because I had perceptions prior to doing this research about what was possible for a woman in that era, or even a man who was not royal or a bishop or a higher level than she was. So I was startled to see any non-royal figure, male or female, develop and informally direct such a global array of ventures as the Duchess of Aiguillon had. And remarkable, too, is that bishops, religious superiors, and diplomats as far afield as Siam, Quebec, and Tunisia answered to the Duchess at times in connection with these projects. So I would find like packs of letters in the archives, sometimes sent back to Europe from some of the people posted in these places, and they would often write similar letter to the King of France, the Pope, maybe a bishop, and the Duchess of Aiguillon. And just seeing these sort of grouped together was just very interesting to see that. Sometimes more information would be in the Duchess's letter than were sent to the technically more powerful people. Now, Marie de Vignerot not only achieved all of this in a period that I would simply not have suspected it was possible for a woman, however high status, to do so, but she also had powerful admirers in her day for all of this, including King Louis XIV as he came of age, and also Pope Alexander VII, who praised her work for the Catholic Church's expansion into other lands in very strong terms. There were some people in France who had the attitude of Knox in his Blast of the Trumpet pamphlet that I showed you at the beginning about the Duchess, but most people, there was sort of a general respect among people of power for the Duchess and her activities. Now, the Pope praised her in 1658 in very strong terms after Marie had convinced him to let her bankroll several new missionary bishoprics for small but growing Catholic populations in several East and Southeast Asian regions that would be controlled by her and her friends in Paris. And indeed, the Duchess played the decisive role in negotiations that led to Pope Alexander VII's decision to allow the French to establish 4 missionary dioceses around the world, and through that to break up a monopoly on ecclesiastical map drawing beyond the borders of old Christendom that Spain and Portugal had enjoyed since the late 1400s. Now, leading this effort to have the Vatican authorize French missionary bishoprics was one of Marie's most remarkable accomplishments, I think, as a laywoman. By the early 1660s, 3 such bishoprics were set up for Asia and a 4th for North America, and they were de facto under French royal control and bankrolled by the Duchess and her friends in Paris. Now, the Duchess's role in the career of one of the new missionary bishops, François Palou, was especially considerable. Palou was the first French bishop appointed for a very large prospective mission territory that was centered in the Vietnamese kingdom of Tonkin. And the Duchess's influence on missionary dioceses also affected places closer to home for us, too. The first Catholic episcopal see, or diocese, established north of Mexico was that of Quebec. And it was created in 1658, and the first bishop stationed in Quebec was a friend of the Duchess, not by coincidence. And François Xavier de Montmorency Laval was, like the men who would venture off to the Far East, formally appointed in Rome, but consecrated as a bishop in Paris in the presence of the Duchess of Aiguillon, her friends, and French officialdom. Now, due to everything I've told you and much more, prominent figures of the Duchess's own time period believed that she would be remembered and honored by future generations. For example, Pope Alexander VII thought that her leadership and contributions to the church would be enough, quote, to carry her the brilliance of her name down through all the centuries. And yet, the Duchess was not well remembered in modern times. Indeed, her legacy was mostly forgotten even in her own country. So at the time I've spent in France, I'll mention her. Usually the only people who really know anything about her are people who have a very kind of sometimes eccentric interest in the old nobility. They might know the niece of Richelieu, but in terms of a historical figure, there's very few people are aware of her in France today even. And her legacy was mostly forgotten, as I said, even in her own country, partly because her memory was tarnished by modern writers who misrepresented her variously as a pious woman who simply did the bidding of powerful churchmen and statesmen. Some also portrayed her as an immoral puppet of her uncle's ambitions, so not someone with her own agency, but someone who just was controlled by Richelieu. And such forgetting and distorting of the historical record actually helped to explain why so many of us presume that in traditional Catholic Christian societies, such as the Duchess's, a woman could not have wielded the kind of power that clearly I now see after my research for this book, she did. So basically what I'm saying is that there are ingrained historical narratives, partly that many of which are rooted in the 19th century, about previous centuries that actually don't have, they just don't represent the facts that well, and they still affect how we look at history today and what was possible. Now, in my work, another commercial here, in my work beyond writing La Duchesse, I've come to see more clearly that the Duchess of Aiguillon was just one figure in a larger tradition of powerful laywomen, many others of whom were sort of largely forgotten or kind of misrepresented in various histories, who influenced historical Christian regimes' political, cultural, and ecclesiastical life in significant ways, but whom, for a variety of reasons, many ordinary people in their history classes or in their exposure to general histories of Christianity are rarely or at best inadequately exposed to. And I cover an array of such women in my newest book, which is just out this month, entitled Women of the Church. Now, I wrote that book for a specifically Catholic press, Ignatius Press, and I sort of address myself primarily to a Catholic audience in that book. But it's one that I wanted to mention here in this setting all the same, since it's relevant to my theme today. Now, in the time that I have left with you, I want to highlight a variety of such powerful women to be found in history, underscoring again ways in which they contributed to the governance and development of politically established churches in their time, ways that, as has been the case with the Duchess of Aiguillon, I believe have not been studied sufficiently over the years and remain misrepresented in various ways in some of our more general, ingrained historical narratives. Now, 2 early historical examples that I want to highlight are the Byzantine Empress Irene of Athens and a Holy Roman Empress named Adelaide. Now, Empress Irene was the widow of the Byzantine Emperor Leo IV. She was also the mother of Emperor Constantine VI. I'm not going to quiz anyone on these names, so I'm done. In the late 700s, while reigning in the place of her son, when he was too young to govern, and in her view also not competent enough to govern the Byzantine Empire, or what had been the eastern half of the Roman Empire, she took actually the masculine form of her title. She had people refer to her as emperor to ensure that it was understood that she was the actual ruler of the Byzantine Empire. And furthermore, she exercised the prerogative that previous emperors, going back to Constantine the Great in the 4th century, had exercised when she called together an ecumenical council of the church, the Second Council of Nicaea, in the year 787. Now, an ecumenical council is a meeting of bishops from throughout the Christian world to settle matters that are dividing Christians in various ways. And the most recent such council in the Catholic Church's history is the Second Vatican Council of the 1960s. The Second Council of Nicaea, as it was called together by Empress Irene, settled a controversy that was tearing Christians violently apart over the proper role that depictions of Christ, the Blessed Mother, and various saints should have. There was actually fighting in the streets over the use of icons and images among Christians in this period. It was really kind of a drawn-out major problem. So that a council was called together to kind of settle what the bishops collectively should say about this. So the use that such images had in the context, especially of Christian worship and cultural life. Now, shocking as it might seem to some people today that a woman played such a leading role in disciplining a divided church in the 8th century, medieval Christians, after Irene's time, developed a robust tradition of particular leading lay people, mostly male, but sometimes female, playing similarly important roles in the life of the church, wherever they held power, be it as kings or queens, dukes or duchesses, or the like throughout Christendom. And in short, in medieval times, it became generally understood that Christian rulers and their family members were specially charged by God to protect and nurture the church in ways distinctive to them as lay people, as opposed to members of the clergy. Now, the story of Holy Roman Empress Adelaide, the second woman depicted on the screen with her husband, helps to illustrate this a bit, I think. Adelaide, who is honored as Saint Adelaide by the Catholic Church, lived in the 10th century. She hailed from Upper Burgundy, in a place that is today in Switzerland, and she was married to a Germanic king, Otto I. Otto and Adelaide were crowned together by the Pope as Holy Roman Emperor and Holy Roman Empress after Otto's armies protected Rome from the armies of another prince who had actually wanted to force Adelaide to marry him, but he did not succeed. Adelaide was indeed consecrated by Pope John XII in a new ceremony specifically for the Empress. So she was anointed, as was her husband, as a representative of God who stood in a line of sacred, in her case, queenship, going back to Queen Esther of biblical times, whereas the Holy Roman Emperor stood in a line of sacred kingship going back to King David of biblical times. That was kind of the way certain church leaders understood this. Now, Adelaide co-ruled with Otto, and she used her power to protect church institutions in a time of chronic warfare. And after her husband died in 973, Adelaide, during the reign of her son, also named Otto, helped reform lax and corrupt monasteries as a friend of two saintly Benedictine abbots, Maiolus and Odilo of Cluny. And she favored their ongoing reform that is remembered historically as the Cluniac Reform. It's one of the most famous reform efforts in the Church's history prior to the period of the Reformation. And she did this when she was also serving in time as Empress Regent for her 5-year-old grandson, Otto III, after her son died prematurely. She devoted the final years of her life to charitable works and the founding and restoration of monasteries and churches. Now, moving now into the late medieval and Renaissance period, we find figures across Christian Europe, such as the 3 women on the screen above. I couldn't find images dating from their time period in each case. First is a 14th century queen of Poland, Jadwiga, who was declared a saint by Pope John Paul II in 1997. Jadwiga lived a short life from 1373 to 1399, but she accomplished significant things for her church and a newly blossoming Christian culture in her region of Europe despite that. Now, Jadwiga became the monarch of Poland, that is, with the powers of a king, not as the consort of a king. So she was monarch in her own right when she was quite young. Her domains were then enlarged by her marriage to the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jagiełło. Now, Lithuania was still largely pre-Christian, religiously speaking at the time, and indeed was seen by Christians then as the last pagan stronghold left in Europe. But the Grand Duke agreed to be baptized as Jadwiga's husband, and he took the Christian name Ladislaw, and Jadwiga and Ladislaw then went on to supervise the conversion of Lithuania. Now, sadly, Jadwiga would end up dying young in childbirth, and her newborn daughter would live only 3 weeks after that. But in the years preceding this tragedy, Jadwiga took a lead in ensuring that her realm was not only more Christian by the end of her reign, but also better educated in theology and a range of other subjects. So she understood the benefits of education. She herself had received an exceptional one for a layperson, let alone for a woman of the period. She had facility with Polish, Hungarian, Latin, German, and possibly Czech. And she established a college in Prague, which was in her domains, and she also patronized a major restoration and expansion of a new but struggling university in Krakow, later renamed Jagiellonian University. And that university's still active theology faculty today dates from the period of Jadwiga's patronage and leadership. And the Queen's hope was that in time, Poland's university would rival that of the great University of Paris, where brilliant scholars such as St. Thomas Aquinas held teaching positions. Had held. He was gone by Jadwiga's time. In time, many excellent scholars would indeed study and teach at Jagiellonian University, and it would become the intellectual heart of Poland for centuries. Now, Jadwiga furthermore helped establish churches and monasteries, devoted resources to the poor, the elderly, and the sick. She was skilled in political negotiations, something needed not just for her secular duties as a monarch, but also for building up the church institutionally. And it's interesting to wonder what else she might have achieved had she simply lived longer. Now, in the Renaissance period, as in medieval times, noble women and royal women sometimes wielded influence in church affairs as foundresses of religious orders and religious communities. And up on the screen in the middle, for example, is a depiction of Françoise of Amboise. I like how the name rhymes. Françoise d'Amboise in French. A duchess from Thouars in western France, who, as the young widow of a powerful duke, turned down an offer of marriage by the King of France, Louis XI, to instead focus on building up monastic institutions in France. And the center, the monastic institution at the center of her projects was at Vannes in Brittany, and she herself eventually became a nun in 1468. Now, the third woman depicted on the screen is Saint Joan of Valois, who was active in the late 1400s. And she was the Queen of France for a time, but due to a marriage against her will to a cousin. And after her marriage was annulled by the church, she founded the Order of the Annunciation of the Blessed Virgin Mary in 1501 and led it as its first abbess, and her order is still active today in various countries. Now, in the Renaissance period, powerful women sometimes affected events at the highest level of ecclesiastical and political affairs, not always in saintly ways that won them devotion among later generations of Christians. Famous examples include the Italian noblewoman Countess Caterina Sforza, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, and the Spanish Queen Isabella of Castile, who I mentioned earlier. Now, Caterina Sforza, who lived from 1463 to 1509, ruled for a time the cities of Forlì and Imola in northern Italy, and she became famous in her lifetime as a warrior as well as a ruler. Now, well-educated as well as trained in fighting, hunting, and horseback riding, she became the wife of a nobleman named Girolamo Riario and eventually bore him 8 children. Now, her husband was made a commander of the papal armies. Those were the days when the popes had armies. And it was Pope Sixtus IV who raised Riario and Caterina up as rulers of Imola and Forlì in the late 1400s. Now, in 1484, When Caterina was only 21 and pregnant with one of her children, she seized control of one of the Pope's fortified castles in Rome, Castel San Angelo. And she did this at the time of Pope Sixtus IV's death in order to prevent the cardinals gathering to choose the next pope from choosing a successor that would, out of a desire to punish those who had been close to the previous pope, remove her and her husband from power. If you think papal politics in the present day can sometimes be bad, just look at this time period and you'll feel better about almost every division you see among Catholics today. With her army, she threatened the cardinals gathering for the papal conclave. Now, although Sforza and her husband were unable to see their choice for the papacy elected in the conclave, they were nevertheless able to preserve their political positions, partly through this bold action on her part. Now, Caterina Sforza would later go on to become one of the main thorns in the side of the corrupt Pope Alexander VI, who had his illegitimate son, Cesare Borgia, force various Italian city-states into submission to the papacy's claims of temporal power. Now, Sforza, whose husband had been killed and whose son was too young to rule Forlì and Imola herself, resisted the papal armies for a time with her own. And she showed a degree of defiance against such papal claims of earthly and not just spiritual power that spoke loudly to other rulers in and beyond Italy. And she was, in the end, though, taken captive as Cesare Borgia got French troops to assist his capture of her lands at Cassis. Now, while the same her story is crucial for understanding some of the drama of papal political and military involvements in the heyday of the Renaissance papacy. Now, Isabella of Castile, a Spanish monarch who was a close contemporary of Sforza's, living from 1451 to 1504, is one of the most famous women in European history. Nicknamed Isabella the Catholic, she influenced church affairs on a grand scale, but also in ways that helped to illustrate challenges to the church's freedom that church-state unions of increasingly centralized monarchical states of the era sometimes posed. Now, Queen Isabella ruled Spain jointly with her husband, King Ferdinand of Aragon. Now, her husband was actually the less powerful of the two. They were both monarchs of separate kingdoms in Spain that then united in one crown of Spain. She was one of the most militant and successful Catholic rulers of the Renaissance period, who, in the face of increasing corruption among some members of the church's clerical hierarchy, were emboldened to assert more control over the church within their realms. Now, Isabella is, of course, famous as the monarch who sponsored Christopher Columbus's world-changing transatlantic voyages. And she's also remembered for her harsh treatment of Jewish and Muslim people in Spain who were forced to convert to Catholicism or leave the country, and who were supervised by the Spanish Inquisition. They were persecuted, by the Spanish Inquisition, but Isabella herself established. The Inquisition in Spain, different from medieval courts of inquisition under direct authority of popes and bishops, which did not those did not have as much power on their own to punish people found guilty of heresy, witchcraft, and the like. The Spanish Inquisition, by contrast, was a new sort of system of state-controlled courts designed to root out heresy. So it was directly controlled by the crown, by the Spanish state. The Spanish Inquisition's activity was so brutal at times that the Pope attempted to stop some of it. But Isabella, who exerted much more direct control over both church and state affairs in Spain at the time than the Pope did, simply ignored the Pope's directives on this. Now, at the same time, simply illustrating the complexity of church-state unions at the time in terms of the varied fruits that they produced, Isabella is also remembered as a serious reformer of moral laxity and abuses of power plaguing the church of her time in Spain. And indeed, she oversaw, with the help of a very talented churchman, Cardinal Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros, whom she handpicked for the position of Archbishop of Toledo, an extensive reform of corrupt and lax Catholic monasteries, convents, and other institutions in Spain, as well as the establishment of a university devoted to biblical studies. This was the University of Alcalá. Now, these significant Catholic reform efforts in Spain, predating the Protestant Reformation elsewhere in Europe, included the banishment of hundreds of misbehaving monks, the return of absentee bishops and parish priests to dioceses and churches they were neglecting, and the production of a remarkable multilingual Bible. I'm entering the home stretch, I promise. Queen Isabella inspired other women of her time to assert themselves in strong ways where church affairs were concerned, and this includes two of her great-grandchildren, princesses who became a queen and an empress respectively, who were famous for their role in protecting and helping the development of one of the most successful male religious orders in Catholic history, the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuits. Juana of Austria, who was the regent of Spain for a time, temporarily ruled Spain on behalf of her brother, King Philip II, in the mid-16th century, and she employed her position to protect the Jesuits during a period when they faced great opposition from political and ecclesiastical officials in Spain. Now, eventually, with Juana's support, the Jesuits became officially favored by the Crown of Spain, and they began to be authorized by the Spanish monarchy to serve as missionaries in colonies in the Americas and Asia. Her sister, Maria of Austria, helped enable the spread and success also of Jesuit projects, including schools and ministries that included advising royal and ducal families as spiritual directors. This was throughout the Holy Roman Empire at the time that she was the empress consort of Maximilian II. Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about Catholic women in this lecture, and this is mainly because of my scholarly expertise in this area. Now, as I mentioned toward the beginning, some of the leading figures of the Protestant Reformation included several female monarchs. Queen Jeanne III, that's Jeanne, Jeanne III of Navarre, who lived from 1528 to 1572, ruled the Kingdom of Navarre for a number of years and was seen in her day as a political as well as spiritual leader of the French Protestant movement, a significant movement that gained a lot of ground in nearby France during a period of a lot of tension, including devastating warfare between French Protestants and Catholics. And Queen Elizabeth I of England's long reign from 1558 to 1603 was absolutely pivotal for the history of the Church of England, or the Anglican Church in her domains, as well as pivotal for the religious and political histories of Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. I could literally give an entire other lecture on that topic, but I will have mercy on you. I've already been speaking a long time, but I cannot give a lecture on this subject without concluding with an historical figure who lived a bit later than the Renaissance period, to underscore again that the role of some women in church and state affairs is quite significant for many centuries in Christian Europe. So up on the screen here is the Holy Roman Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. She lived from the year 1717 to 1780, and she was among the most powerful figures in all of European history, let alone one of the most powerful Christian women. Together with her son, Emperor Joseph II, with whom she co-ruled for a time after ruling on her own for many years, she's famous for having caused some new rifts among her fellow Catholics with state-driven efforts to subordinate the Jesuits, other clergymen and religious, and various Catholic schools and charitable institutions to state power. So in sort of the marriage of church and state in her time, she wanted the state, as directed by her as the empress, to sort of have fuller say over the church in all aspects. Now, Maria Theresa, for 40 years, from 1740 to 1780, she ruled over the Holy Roman Empire and other domains controlled by the Habsburg dynasty. And she did this while at the same time being a devoted wife and mother of 16 children. And her husband, Emperor Francis Stephen, was just a figurehead and served as one of her advisors, a very loyal advisor, I will say. Now, her reign was consequential for the church and European politics and culture. Excuse me. Despite her youth, when she first became empress, at the age of 23, Maria Theresa impressed seasoned statesmen and soon became famous for reforming governmental and financial institutions, the military, medicine, education, commerce, and agriculture. And at the same time, she opposed some new ideas being advanced by liberal thinkers, such as favoring religious diversity, and she encouraged efforts to convert Protestants to Catholicism within her domain. So she believed church and state should be even more closely united than they ever had been. But this did not mean that church officials were to control political affairs. Rather, Maria Theresa and other state officials would increasingly control ecclesiastical institutions and properties within Habsburg domains. And the state selected and oversaw many of the men who became bishops and supervised Catholic hospitals, orphanages, and schools, including seminaries. So she favored what scholars call nationalizing the church in her domains. She sought to empower state-employed bishops in new ways in relation to both the papacy and the larger body of the Catholic faithful. And she began to remove Jesuits and other members of religious orders from positions of influence and favored the suppression of the Jesuits and some other orders, those who kind of had a higher view of papal power than imperial power. She wanted the bishops' religious orders to be loyal to her state power above all. Now, a darker aspect of her reign is the anti-Semitism that her government promoted. She kind of softened on this over time due to the influence of Abraham Mendel Tabin. He's a Hungarian Jewish leader who convinced her to change certain policies that she had put in place. Now, there's more I could say about her, but I won't. Her example, I would say, simply points us to some of the challenges to the freedom of Christian churches that the sort of church-state unions that allowed certain prominent lay people, including some women, as you've seen, to wield a lot of power and influence in church affairs, seemed increasingly to be causing on the eve of the Revolutionary era that saw the toppling of some traditional Catholic monarchies, including France's, in favor of new liberal and democratizing regimes. Now, without minimizing those challenges, I simply would like to point out that the sort of historical research that I've been doing, especially on figures such as the Duchess of Aguillon, has made me conclude that along with some of the salutary benefits for numerous people that revolutionary changes in recent centuries have led to, some things were also lost in the process. On the Catholic side, for example, these include the ability of certain good lay elites, including some lay women, to help govern and discipline the church on a local level, and to cultivate good ministries and missions on a large scale without having always to wait, and sometimes wait for the action and approval of bishops or popes to do so. The latter is the norm in modern times, I would say. Now, one of the ironies of Christianity's history in modern times, indeed, is that the ability of at least some lay women to help direct some ecclesiastical affairs at higher levels markedly declined in the era of revolutionary liberalism and political democratization. And indeed, that loss of power and influence of Christian women from the various traditional ruling families of Christendom was so complete by the late 19th century that by the time our own grandparents and parents were coming of age, a misperception had set in, certainly throughout the Catholic world at least, that lay people, especially lay women, had been powerless in church affairs from time immemorial. Now, the study of history has been enabling me to sift through with greater confidence what in my own earlier historical education was based on myths versus what was based on facts and historical records. And I hope that this exploration, detailed, I know, that's what historians do, of the subject of powerful women in historic, especially Renaissance-era regimes, has helped to illustrate that to you effectively, and in ways that I hope have increased at least a few of you, interested at least a few of you enough to ask me some questions here. So thank you very much. Thank you.